right. We are ready. Okay, we'll just start with the first section. So how does this lesson connect to and build on students' prior skills and knowledge? What was taught before this lesson and what will come after it? Discuss the sequence of lessons that surrounded this one lesson.
Today's lesson was an extension of the lesson that that was previously taught, where the students had to look at the physical properties of the polymers and plastics at their tables, and then decide on the chemical structure of the polymer. Today, the extension was to then talk about what happens at the end life of the polymer, what can happen when it's disposed of, or how it can be recycled. And it taught kids to think about, or it looked for students to think about what impact that's having on the ecosystem and the oceans in particular as well. After this lesson, we'll discuss a little bit more about what they found in their reading, their answers to their questions when they come back. And then we'll take it one more step further and we'll talk about each of the symbols on the bottom of their plastics, 1 through 6, and what that means. And we'll read a brief article on the history of that code.
Cool. I've always been curious about that code.
Mm-hmm.
Wiki that. All right, so let's talk about the standards or cluster target in this lesson. What you do to make the lesson reflect the full intent of that standard or cluster?
So the standards that were covered in this particular lesson were standards 11, 12, point 2, point 5, and point 7. And so in point 12, thinking about the article, or I'm sorry, point 2, 11, 12.2, thinking about the central ideas of that article and really breaking it down into its parts of the mechanical recycling, the feedstock recycling, and source reduction. And 12.7, multiple sources of information. The students gathered information from the article, from the text itself, and then from the video on the speech. So putting that together with the article and thinking about specifically source reduction and its ties to polymers.
All right. Which of the core action indicators do you think this lesson best exemplified? How do you plan for this?
This lesson really exemplifies core action 1, part A, B, and C, I believe, because students were engaged in part A. They were engaged in multiple texts. They were looking through their reading. They watched the video. They put these two together to come up with some answers. And then the text complexity, part B of core action 1. The text was complex. There was a lot of words that might have been new to them that they might have had to break apart. And then finally, the text, part C, the text was clear and it was relevant to what it is they're studying, the polymers, and what can happen at the end of the polymer's life.
Cool. All right. This is the part 2. Discuss how this lesson illustrates the shifts required by the CCSS.
Okay, one second. Okay, so the shifts are a part of the CCSS that is telling us how we need to make adjustments in our classroom to incorporate the Common Core State Standards. And so this lesson addressed the shifts by implementing a college-level text with a high complexity of word and language. And the students had to, in their groups, break this text apart. And so that in itself is part of the shift, is the rigor of that text. And also, all of the answers that they came up with and the questions were all based on not opinions, but on the evidence they could pull from the article or from the video. So the questions were evidence-based and required the students to state where they got their evidence from, or specifically what the evidence was. So maybe that means a direct quote from the article, or maybe that means something that was said in the speech. And finally, they had to practice with complex text, being the video and the article, and they had to pull it apart, and they had to annotate it, and they had to ask questions about it. And so that is also part of the shift.
Excellent. All right. Let's see. How do you teach the content of this lesson prior to the CCSS? We asked that yesterday.
Yeah,
Prior.
this is one. Never taught it before. Fresh teacher.
Excellent. All right, so third section here. How did the students handle this lesson? Did they understand the mathematics of the lesson? How do you know?
Uh-oh, I think this is for math.
Yeah, I think that more just,
We want the English.
yeah.
You want the other one?
This one, I think that maybe that is the, this might be a different, yeah, you might be right.
I think I have a copy of it.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry about that. Yep. Third section. How did or do you support all students in working with grade level text? How did you create opportunities for students who are advanced to engage more deeply with grade level or above grade level text?
In order to make sure that every student was engaged in the text, I first did an example in front of the class to help scaffold the students that might need a little bit of help on how to break down a paragraph. You know, what are the tricks we use, like circling an important word or boxing an important word, and then from that box annotating, or underline important thoughts of the paragraph. And then in order to engage in conversation, they had to speak with one another about what they thought was important. So by doing that, the person that was reading that maybe was having a hard time with the text could still be supported by the person who might be across from them that is really getting a good grasp on the text. And so the person reading might not be sure what's important, and they can ask their table partners what they thought was important, or they might express what's important themselves, and then their table partners might encourage them to, ask why did you pick that to underline. So by opening up the conversation with them at their stations, it really catered to each level of reader. They were all reading the same text, and they were all asking each other questions about the text.
How do you know that students were able to successfully respond to the text-dependent questions and tasks with precision? Did students acquire the literacy skills addressed in the lesson? What did you do for students who did not acquire the literacy skills addressed in this lesson?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that one?
Sure.
It's a long one.
Yeah, it is. How do you know that students were able to successfully respond to the text-dependent questions and tasks with precision? Did students acquire the literacy skills addressed in this lesson? What did or do you do for students who did not acquire the literacy skills addressed in this lesson?
In order to address these skills, I was really, and I was listening to the groups. And so I would go group to group, listen to the reader, listen to what he or she had to say about the important parts of that piece of the text. And if I felt that they weren't digging deep enough into the text, then I'd push them along and ask them, well, okay, you didn't circle this word here, and so what does this mean, and can you explain this to me or to your group? And sometimes they could, and they were able to, and at other times, by asking them that, they said, well, wait a minute, I don't understand what that means, and I don't understand what this phrase means, so let's then have a discussion about it as a group. And so by going group to group, listening, and even going backwards, so if a group was already finished with something that I knew might be difficult or a difficult piece, a part of that literature, then I went back and I asked them about it and found out what they had to say about the text.
All right, this will be about Core Action 3. Which behaviors from Core Action 3 did the students best exemplify in this lesson? What actions have you taken as a teacher to make that happen?
Core Action 3 is about engagement, and I think the most important piece here in Core Action 3 is that the students were able to make their own choices within their group about what was important. They were able to share those choices with the rest of the group, and by doing that, it became theirs. You know, they really got to own that paragraph, they got to own that piece of the literature, and they got to tell the other students what they thought about it. So by doing that, they were engaged in their portion of the text.
All right, so the last two. Reflecting on the lesson, what worked particularly well, and what might you do differently?
Within the lesson, I think the piece that worked well was the beginning by myself just giving them a quick introduction on how I would break apart the text and the scaffolding that I showed them and used for my expectations of how they're going to break apart their paragraphs. I liked how I showed them the full article that I read, and that, you know, this is something that I do, and so it's useful and it is important. And then by making them or having them, you know, read out loud to each other in their groups, I liked that part of the lesson as well. The one concern I had as I went from group to group was I didn't see enough of the annotating. A lot of kids were highlighting, a lot of kids were underlining, but they weren't asking enough questions. So I might, next time I teach them, I might talk a little bit more about, you know, where it's appropriate to ask a question, and then what we can do, you know, to find the answer. Because sometimes this close reading can be awkward because it breaks apart, you know, the reader, and, you know, you only get through 2 sentences, and you ask a lot of questions, but it disrupts the flow. And so, but I want them to learn, okay, maybe we can read first, and then we can go back. And so the flow of the reading isn't as interrupted. But it's still important that we ask, you know, ourselves, do we really understand this text? Do we really understand what this sentence means? And what does it have to do with what we just read before?
Yeah. All right, last one. Were there any surprises or unexpected student behaviors or reactions?
No, I don't know how to answer this question.
Yeah. All right. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank
Yep.
you.
Yay.
Perfect. Did anyone